Okay, everybody on the outside, come on in. We'll get things going here. I'd like to welcome all of you. I'm Alan Alsop. I'd like to welcome you to the continuation of the summer series. And we'd like to welcome all those on Facebook and YouTube and our website, ststephenumc.net, for joining us this morning. We're very pleased to have with us today, continuing our summer studies, Ken Garfield. Ken is a journalist, writer, and editor, and if any of you have been in Charlotte for a good long time, you know Ken. You feel like you know him. He was with the Charlotte Observer for 21 years. He's been a journalist for 31 years. He was religion editor for the Charlotte Observer. Then he spent 12 years at Myers Park United Methodist Church as communications director. He has written for Duke Divinity School, the New York Times, the Christian Century, Religion News Service, and other publications, and he's the author of several books, including Billy Graham, A Life in Pictures. Ken was also an editor of the book Much Abides, which a survival guide for aging lives by Dr. Charles Edwards. And I will say the Joy class did a 2-week study on that book, and I would highly recommend it if you're aging. So Ken's calling to devote his life to newspapers and journalism was a calling that led to a passion to tell people's stories. And over the years, he discovered that all of us have a rich and a powerful story to tell and a legacy to ultimately share. And Ken translated that into another career of writing obituaries for people. Ken and his wife Sharon have 2 adult children and 2 grandchildren. So let's give a warm welcome to Ken Garfield.
Can everybody hear me? Yes. Okay, if you can't, just raise your hand as we go on. We are all of a certain age, so I'm very sensitive to that. Charles asked me if I'd ever been in this church before, and I go back to when Jody Seymour was here, and I saw the pictures on the wall, and I go back, I think that was maybe the 20th century. Well, it was. So, and I remember writing about the Langfords when they were here and about being a husband and wife team. And I remember I was friends with Kelly Kiesling. Does anybody remember Kelly? She's a lovely person. That was a very, very sad story. Is her family still here? Are they? Yeah, her kids were high school age, I think, when she passed. So I go back with St. Stephen, and I go back with, I can drive around town. I said, well, I was in that church, and I did that story, and I was in that church, and I did that story. And it was a blessing, which we'll talk about a little bit. What I like to do is start off by offering sort of what we're going to talk about and sort of frame our conversation. And I hope you will take this in the spirit of conversation and dialogue. Skepticism is a good thing. I was at Myers Park Methodist for 12 years, so I saw how the hamburger is made, and I can share some observations about that. And about calling and good fortune and luck and being in the right place at the right time, and how those all shape a life, my life, and is what I'll talk to you about, but also your life. What role all those things play in your life, that's what I want to talk about. So let me begin by saying, so a calling, I define calling, and it is hearing God's whisper on your life and answering that. The second definition was also usually vocationally, so we're going to talk about that. We will not talk about another definition I found about a calling, which is you call the moves for square dancing. So calling is a complicated word, and it has a lot we won't talk about that one, but we will talk about that. So let me say this. What is God's calling? What is it when you follow a whisper, a prayer, a yearning? What is it when you follow that whisper and that yearning and it doesn't work out? I have a good friend in town whose husband is a pastor, and he heard the call to a Baptist church in a little town in Texas, and he heard God calling him to this church, and after 2 years, he heard God calling him back to Matthews, North Carolina, because it didn't work out. What is that? Was that this gentleman? Was it God? Did he hear the wrong thing from God? So I want to talk about that, and that's maybe the skepticism. Was it, what did he hear that drove him to Texas, and what did he hear that literally drove him back? So I want to talk about some of that. Let me just tell you about, and I'm always uncomfortable talking just about myself, so I want to hear questions, and I want to hear your life journey. But let me tell you just a couple of snapshots in my life that took me where I am to this morning right here in front of you. So I was raised in a Reformed Jewish household outside New York. My dad was an optometrist. Mom was stay-at-home until I, the third one, left home and she moved back into the work world. I was raised in a Reformed Jewish house that focused on social service, that focused on living beyond ourselves, that focused on the world beyond us. I have very vivid memories. We, of course, had television, but I have very vivid memories of sitting in the kitchen with the radio on, listening to the news of Dr. King's assassination and Robert Kennedy's assassination. I remember in 1969, I think it was, maybe 1970, a movie came out called Easy Rider, and it was about finding yourself traveling through this troubled world. And I remember, I might have used it as an excuse, but I came home one day with a really bad report card. And I was a senior in high school getting ready for college, and my parents looked at my report card, and I said, it doesn't matter anyway, because the world's going to end in nuclear Armageddon, so I do not have to get good grades. Fortunately, my grades improved, and we're still here. But those are the moments I remember. So I go off to a little college called Hampshire College in Amherst, Massachusetts, and I last 1 year, and then I dropped out. I guess this was God's call or a waste of 3 months. I dropped out and worked for George McGovern. Does anybody vaguely remember George McGovern? That didn't quite work out the way we thought it would. So I dropped out from George McGovern. I went back to Hampshire and got my degree. Let me back up a minute. Another very seminal moment in my life, and these are what I'm trying to say, is these little snapshots that stick with you that are very formative. I remember my dad, for some reason, was picking me up on May 4th, 1970, sunny day in the little town we lived in Long Island, and I got in the car and he said, I want to tell you that 4 kids were shot and killed at Kent State University. And I don't know why that stuck with me, but number one, that provoked or inspired a lifelong interest and heart for that incident as a turning point in both American life and in my life, because it kindled something about loss. And I've spent a lot of my career writing about loss, trying to understand loss. And I think it started on that day, in fact, when my dad told me that. I can't explain why that was, but again, God's call on my life, good fortune. This is an odd story that I think about. My freshman year of college, second year, that my professor sends me to Kent, Ohio to cover the trials of the students who rioted that day rather than the guardsmen who shot them. I was a dumb 18-year-old. I land in the airport in Akron, Ohio. It happens to be in Akron, Ohio in November, a snowstorm. And I had no way to get from Akron to Kent, which is about 30 miles. And so I summon the courage and I tap who appears to be a student on the shoulder, And I say, can you give me a ride to Kent? And he said, yes, I can. It turns out to be one of the 9 kids who was shot at Kent State. Kind of small world, good fortune, a blessing, whatever that was. Tom Grace and I have stayed in touch over all these years. I email him every May 4th and say I'm thinking about him. So what is that? Is that a moment that was luck, coincidence, God touching my life? Be thinking about that. So I go off to college. We didn't have grades, thankfully, for me, because I would have done what I did in high school. But I discovered journalism, and I discovered working on the school newspaper, and I did that, and that's when it began my formative years in journalism. At one point, I did an internship in Washington with one of the congressmen who was on the original Nixon impeachment committee. If you go back to Sam Ervin in 1972, it's Charles Rangel, and I worked for in his office when he was on that committee. And this was back in the day, one Saturday night, you could walk into the congressional buildings and there was no security. And I lay down on his couch and I read All the President's Men. And that was another, Woodward and Bernstein, that was another formative moment that kept pointing me or nudging me in the direction of journalism and storytelling. So I'm at college, another moment. Somehow I find myself in the hallway where the Alumni Affairs office is, where they post job openings. And I was still a senior, and I saw a job opening for a little newspaper in upstate New York. Next thing you know, I'm working at the newspaper in upstate New York in 1975 and beginning to love journalism and storytelling for a living. I remember a snapshot seminal moment there. It was a weekly, and the first Wednesday night I was in this town. Anybody know upstate New York? A couple. Millerton, New York, near Poughkeepsie, if you know where that is. And it was a Wednesday night, and there was a store in town that sold newspapers and guns, which was a great combination. Turney's store. And so I drove up to wait for the newspaper, and it was a beautiful spring night in April in upstate New York. And as I parked, I noticed all these folks coming in pickups and cars the same way I was outside Turney's store, and they were there to pick up the newspaper. So wait for it to come off the truck and buy their local newspaper. Another moment that stayed with me, that gosh, you could produce a newspaper in the news of the community, and people cared about what I wrote. People cared about the stories I was telling. So that was another seminal moment. I seem to have all these little blessings that have kind of carried me along on this journey. And I'm in a men's group, and we talk about our journeys and whether it was planned out, and a lot of people plan their journey out very specifically, and a lot of people like me just sort of go with the tide. And I guess the tide could have taken me into a school of sharks or wherever, but it took me on this path that I was blessed. Whether that was luck, good fortune, or God's hand on my life, I still think about that. Another one, I was in upstate New York, in this little town, Millerton, New York, and I happened to begin a relationship with a woman who moved to Charlotte. And I barely knew where North Carolina was on the map. And I said, well, Charlotte sounds nice. Next thing you know, I am living in Morganton, North Carolina, where I began my career down here. Now, this is another moment. It was very hard in 1976 for a guy from New York with hair down to here to get a job in North Carolina. It was not the town, the state it is now. So I had finally got an offer from the Gaston Gazette. And I remember that it was the Gaston Gazette. Gastonia had a certain reputation, so the trial story I did for them was about some guy in jail about something. And they called me and offered me the job, and I accepted it. And then literally a day later, the Morganton editor offered me a job, and I didn't know one from another. I all but flipped a coin and ended up in Morganton, where I met my wife, Sharon, my wife of 44 years. If I had taken the Gastonia job, who knows? So Sharon and I often talk about, is our fate luck, God, whatever. She's a good Presbyterian, and she doesn't think it was God's hand. She thinks it was just good fortune, luck. Again, all these moments, and I'm blessed to acknowledge that they were all blessed moments for me on my journey. So I rise up in journalism. I go from Morganton to Shelby. Shelby, great barbecue, not a great newspaper. So Bridges Barbecue is the one we preferred. But I make lifelong friends there. Then I moved from Shelby to Lawrence, South Carolina, which I can't say has a lot of great anything. But our kids were born there in Lawrence, and because Sharon's from Statesville, and we wanted to get back to North Carolina, I took the worst job known to man at the Charlotte Observer. This is back when everybody read the paper, when the paper was extremely profitable, and so I was hired as the night's assistant sports editor. So I had two little babies, and I would go into work at 1 or 1:30 in the afternoon and get home about 11:30 or midnight. And literally, Sharon was working in town for a business, and we had a half hour together in the afternoon, and the common ground that we found was 1 o'clock in the afternoon, lunch, and all my children. Then I'd go off to work. It was the worst 2 years, but I made wonderful friends, and I began different opportunities at the newspaper. So I end up in Charlotte, and I'm covering general assignment stories, plane crashes, Garth Brooks, some sports, whatever came my way. I had a reputation, well-deserved, for being a fast writer, for being able to turn in stories very quickly. This would have been about 1992. There's a lovely woman who was a religion writer named Kathleen McLean. She has since passed away, and she had done it a long time, and she's burned out on it, really. So I had filled in for her a little bit. Another good fortune. In the 2 months that I filled in for her, Billy Graham, obviously from Charlotte, held the largest gathering ever in Central Park, New York. And the paper sent me up there. It's a gorgeous day in Central Park. The crowd was filled. My parents still lived in the city. I said, this is a pretty good beat. But I came back. They said, congratulations, you're going to be the religion writer. And I said, oh, God, don't do that, please. I do not want to cover religion, because I thought at that time religion writing was all Baptists fighting about this or that, Southern Baptist conventions, Presbyterians fighting over slavery and other historic issues. I said, let me do this for 3 months and then let me get out. And I remember, never forget it, the first story I did was on a late Friday afternoon at Providence Baptist Church. And it was a meeting of it's over on Randolph Road. It was a meeting of, I think, the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. I remember two things. It rained like a monsoon, and I had the worst headache I've ever had to this day in my entire life. And I said, oh my God, this is the religion beat. And I kind of dreaded it, but over time, I realized fairly quickly that this was going to be a life-changing experience, not just a professional changing experience, but a life-changing, because I began to understand people's journeys, people's stories, where faith fit in. I was covering, instead of the things of this world, I was covering cosmic issues, life, death, what you believe about God, His calling on your life, how people intersect with their faith. And so I did that for 12 life-changing years. It was wonderful. That's how I ended up in probably half of what used to be 600 churches in Charlotte, probably more now. I covered 90% of beautiful things, people devoting their lives to service, people who would, at the drop of a hat, go to the scene of a tornado and help, churches that would open their doors to the homeless. I also covered the other side of religion. I covered Jim and Tammy. Right now, this crowd, I don't have to say a last name. Anybody under the age of 40, I have to say Jim and Tammy Baker, those people who were on TV. I covered Jim and Tammy. I remember going to the Charlotte Convention Center on a Friday night, and see if you can remember his name. I covered an ex-con evangelist who looked and dressed like Elvis, an Elvis lookalike, and he sold miracle water out of Harris Teeter milk jugs. And he would pour out the milk and pour in the water and sell miracle water. And older ladies would come up with literally pennies and dollar bills to buy miracle water. I covered Benny Hinn. That was Leroy Jenkins, by the way. I think has passed. I covered Benny Hinn. Has anybody ever heard of him? He was a faith healer. He would heal what ails you, and he would come to the Coliseum. And the point I'm trying to make here is I would always look for the good in any of those stories. So instead of focusing on Benny Hinn, I would never forget the sight. Remember the old Coliseum and the bushes down the middle from the parking lot? Remember standing out there and watching a sort of a line of people marching into the Coliseum with wheelchairs, oxygen tanks, walkers, looking for a miracle. And so I wrote about those people as opposed to Benny Hinn. It became a blessing because I got to know people who were living their lives according to what God tells them to do. I truly loved it. It was life-changing. You work on Sundays on the Religion Beat, so I never accompanied my family to our own church because I was always in somebody else's church. I passed Central Church of God coming over here. There are a lot of cars at Central Church of God. Remember being there the first Sunday after 9/11. Covered the Billy Graham crusade in 96. Anybody was at that Billy Graham crusade in 96? I wrote Billy Graham's obituary 10 years before he passed, and I like to say that he outlived 3 newspaper companies because Knight Ridder, then someone else, then McClatchy bought the paper, and every time it sold, I would call the newspaper and say, you better find the Billy Graham obit in the computer because you're going to need it one day. And so I wrote about that. What a blessing that was. So then I go to Myers Park United Methodist Church for a couple of reasons. This was 2006 when newspapers, I like to think of newspapers as on a roller coaster, and I covered newspapers right about there, and then in 2006 it started to go like that. And so I kind of saw the writing on the wall, and I ended up at Myers Park United Methodist as the director of communications. When I worked at the paper, you could have a speaker on the demise of newspapers. There were something like 235 people in the newsroom. Now there are 30. There is no newsroom. I think 3 of the 5 papers that I've worked at demolished their buildings. We all read online. Newspapers are not what they were. So I got out at the right time. I remember going to Myers Park, and I said, I'm going to come to Hot Wednesday, their Wednesday night community supper, to start meeting people. And Bill Roth, the pastor for pastoral care there, said, of all the Wednesday that Ken's going to come, we're serving ham. So I'm not kosher, so it didn't matter. And being a Jew, it never really affected my work as religion editor nor at the church, because I was looking at the big picture. I was looking for the good in everything until someone convinced me otherwise, like Leroy Jenkins. So I always looked for the good, and I was able to put my faith and my beliefs to the side and honor other people's faith in my writing. So I did that. I will say working in a church is an experience. Has anyone ever worked in a church? It's yeah. Oh, no. Good, I'll pray for you. Interesting, you see how the hamburger is made. I like to tell people in Myers Park we had 2 floors. And it was a little bit of upstairs, downstairs. You had people who were there because they were called to be there, whether they were the pastor or lady, and there were people that they didn't get the job at the insurance office, so they got the job at a church. So it was a very, very interesting experience. I loved the people. both the laity and the staff, most of them. I love the telling of stories, and that's what I'm going to talk about now what I'm doing now. But everybody has a story, and I think that my best work was done whether Sunday morning hanging out in the lobby or during the week hanging out at the coffee pot in the gift shop, just talking to people, hearing people's stories. And that has become the calling of my life. I went to a baseball game last night with two friends from the paper. One's still there, one's gone. But we talked about just talking to people, waiting in the concourse during the rain delay, talking to your waiter. Because everybody has an interesting story. And so that has sort of been the shape of my professional and personal life. My wife, when we go to restaurants or whatever, she ends up pulling me away from a conversation with a stranger because I want to hear their story. And I think that has become this journey that I've been on, and it's come to this point. As now I am a freelance writer, I edit books, I do obituaries, and I want to talk about that a little bit, because I'm interested in helping people tell their stories. And that combined with loss has kind of shaped what I do. So I had written, anybody read The Ledger? Ledger is a wonderful new online newspaper in Charlotte, newsletter started by two former Observer colleagues of mine. And these things all over the country have taken the place of newspapers. And so every Tuesday they publish a Ways of Life newsletter in which I and other writers profile someone who has passed away. And it's typically not a famous person, typically not a name you know, but just an average person. So, for instance, let me see if I can find it. So I will do all sorts of obituaries. Here's one I did on Tammy Faye. I wrote Tammy Faye's before she died. Anybody seen Eyes of Tammy Faye, the movie?
I was in the movie, by the way.
What's that? So, I'll tell you two things about Jim and Tammy when I covered the aftermath. And so this is, again, I covered Jim. He'd gotten out of prison. He had started a ministry in Los Angeles. And so he would let me interview him, but I had to go to Los Angeles. So this is when the paper had money. They sent me to Los Angeles. Then at some point, Tammy, who divorced Jim while he was in prison and married the guy that built Calvary Church, Roe Messner, she had published a memoir, which was about what you'd think a memoir from Tammy Faye would be. And she would let me interview her, but she would only let me interview her in Palm Springs, California. Somebody had to do it, right? So I got to know Tammy a little bit. She yelled at me once when I insulted her son in the newspaper. We had somewhat of a relationship. So I'd written Tammy. I wrote a lot of these obituaries in advance. I wrote Tammy Faye Messner, whose can-do Christian cheer helped her survive the PTL scandal and forge a second career as a pop culture queen, died Friday after battling cancer for more than a decade. I want to talk to you a little bit about obituaries, but one of the things about obituaries is, I'm not sure what this means, we'll have to kind of go over it in your mind, but I can sum up a life of 85 years in 600 words. Now, I don't know what that means. We live 85 years, and I can capture the essence of a life in one line or in 600 words. So for Tammy, I wrote, for Tammy Faye, like Elvis, no last name was necessary. So, but the ones I really like writing, either for the Ledger in this Ways of Life newsletter, or when I'm writing obituaries, people will hire me to write an obituary. I did one on a woman, she an elderly Catholic woman, and someone told me She was in her 90s at St. Gabriel Catholic Church. And someone told me during her son's eulogy in St. Gabe's, way down at the bottom of the eulogy, he mentioned an interesting fact. She once dated John F. Kennedy. So I said, well, I've got to write about that. So I wrote, no matter how long and rich their lives, there are people in this world who had a moment that rises above their biography. Share their story, and the universal response is, she did what? So the short story is she was part of a group of Catholic women that would go on vacation every summer, and they were called the Dirty Girls. And they would go buy a case of beer at a convenience store and come back the next morning and buy another case. So she's sitting, the Dirty Girls are vacationing on Cape Cod. She's sitting in a bar in Hyannisport, and who comes in and tries to pick up the women? Well, John F. Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy. She's the only one with the courage or chutzpah or whatever to go to the party with JFK. And so she ended up dating JFK. And so I wrote, at some point in the evening, Jack walked into a bar with Billy and everyone applauded. At another point, Jack and Billy, quote unquote, parked the car. That's all that needs to be said about that. So it's become, I do about 20, 25 a year. People will call me before the fact, and they get a bad diagnosis. Their family members will call me. Some do it when they're in their health, and they're the kind of people that have everything, every dimension of their life planned out and organized. Some will call me after the fact, and I'll do it very quickly, working with their families. Some do it because they don't want to put their children through the angst and emotion of writing their father's or mother's obituary after a passing. So it's been a privilege for me to come beside people, comfort them in this way, provide a service. Mostly, though, it's been a privilege for me to tell their story and to see the universal lessons of life and how my journey tracks with their journey, and how my journey from a kid in New York whose dad broke the news about Kent State to 50 years later, helping people tell their story at the end of life. I typically, I like the everyday people, the everyday people the most. But every once in a while, someone will call me who you know. So they called me from Leon Levine's office from Family Dollar about a month before he died. He had Parkinson's, and they knew the end was coming. And so I got to write Leon Levine's obituary. And it's an amazing story. Small-town Jewish kid from Rockingham, works in his family's discount store in Rockingham. He tells his mom after his dad's passing, why don't we take the stuff that's not selling and open it up as a discount store in the basement? And that's how Family Dollar was born. Now, his life was divided into two parts, building this empire and then retiring and giving the proceeds away. It's an amazing life story. But the best part of writing his obituary were the smaller stories that bring him, no pun intended, to life, that really tell his story. So these were the best part, and I kind of had to convince the family to let these stories go into the obituary, because it's not what you usually read in obituary. While driving the South Carolina back roads to his condo at Myrtle Beach, he and his cousin Lewis, they'd love to stop at Family Dollars on the way. He and his cousin Lewis walked into one Family Dollar store. It was empty, no customers, no employees in sight. So they picked up the cash register, carried it to their car, walked back in, and grabbed something small to buy. The look on that manager's face when he went to ring it up was not pretty. And I tell another story, but then I say, no wonder Family Dollars on the way to the beach would alert each other, the boss is coming. I think that, and I'll stop here and we can have a conversation. I think that speaks to what we're talking about here and what you've been studying about calling. What leads people down the roads that they take? How do our roads intersect? how do we serve God, or whatever we believe about life and the life to come, whatever we believe, what leads us to serve, what leads us to do what we do. What I always ask families when I'm writing their obituaries, what's your loved one's legacy? What will we remember about him? What stories bring that legacy to life? I think a lot about legacy. I think about my own and these little moments along the way that just blessed me. And I think about other people who plan very carefully and listen for God's whisper and what that means. I think, and I'll stop here, I think about when I was at the paper. I was there 21 years. I was there in newspapers 30. I loved every minute of it. My son followed me into newspapers and then followed me into Methodist work. He's a communications director for the Methodist Foundation. And I always thought to myself, if I become a prison guard and then he becomes a prison guard, God and I are going to have a talk. But I have yet to become a prison guard. But I think about all that and what it means to my life and what my legacy means. And I think that's what we all should think about all the time, especially when we reach a certain age in life, is what our legacy is, what role God has played in it, what role a calling, a whisper has played in it. I'll never forget leaving newspapers after 30 years. I got an offer to come to work at Myers Park United Methodist Church. My wife has a furniture store, and I was helping her move furniture. This is when she couldn't afford anyone better than me. And we were delivering a sofa in Gaffney, South Carolina. And we were coming up on the deadline for me to call the church and accept the job or not accept it. And I remember carrying the sofa and putting it in this gentleman's house, and then literally on a hot day, walking behind a dumpster in Gaffney, South Carolina, making the decision to go to Myers Park United Methodist Church. I'm not sure that was a calling, a lucky guess, an unlucky guess, but it's interesting how lives can turn on a moment. And that moment was behind a dumpster in Gaffney, South Carolina. Another moment was passing the jobs help wanted sign at my college and reading about a little newspaper. Another was tossing a coin in the air and going to Morganton instead of Gastonia. So I think about all that, and I guess the final reflection I'll share with you is I hope you think about that. I hope you think about your legacy. I hope you think about what matters. Perhaps you put it in writing. Perhaps we just did a video. Anybody know Bishop Herb Spa, who passed away? We did a video for Susie about her husband's life. That's another way to tell your story. A lot of people call me to help them write their biography for their grandkids, just to have it put in writing, just so they'll know, Grandpa's story, legacy, and journey. So I think it's all wrapped up. And, Sunday at noon when you leave this place, I hope those are the things that you think about. So let me stop there.
Do we have any questions?
Oh, come on. Ooh, you've hit on a big one now. Yeah. Yes, I do. And what the challenge that I face as an obituary writer is to break the mold that you see. They used to all run in the newspaper. Now, because of the cost of the newspaper obituary, the fact that very few people are reading it, now they go online on the funeral home website. And so, yes, the challenge is to break the mold of born here, served in these churches, served in these jobs. The real big one that a pet peeve is country clubs. He enjoyed playing golf at Charlotte Country Club. But country club is not a key factor in your life, I don't think. So yes, I do. And I try to say, let's focus on the memories and the rich stuff in your life that includes humor. So yes, it is very hard to get people to get past that, that original sort of formulaic obituary. I remember I wrote an obituary for Dave Cribbs. Anybody remember Dave? He was an insurance salesman in town, his wife Barbara. They were at the paper. He had second time with cancer was the end, last time. And he would go to the Harris Y at 6 a.m. and meet some friends to swim together. And they would swim behind Dave to make sure that he made it to the other side. Those are the moments. The other moment is we were sitting in the den living room with Barbara and Dave planning his obituary and a funeral service. And she said, "I am having so much fun planning Dave's funeral." So, but we knew what she meant. So those are the moments that I'm looking for. Leon Levine hoisting a cash register away.
Go in here.
You know, you'd mentioned early on in your talk about the Baptist preacher, right, going from Matthews to Texas and back. And so the question maybe some of us struggle with is how do we discern God's calling as opposed to kind of modifying something into what we might otherwise want to do, right? So how do we discern that?
What happens when what happens when a call doesn't work out? Is that your fault? Is it God's fault? Did you mishear the call? That's a question for Will Willimon or some of the other theologians that you've had here, not a lowly journalist. But I think about that all the time. She is a dear person. We had coffee the other day, and she recounted this 2-year journey. And that's what I thought to myself is, you know, what was this? She had the courage to go in a different direction, but whose fault was it that direction? So was it anybody's fault? Is it just life? Is it fate? Is it she arrived at this Texas church at the wrong moment? Could she have known that there was dissension in the church, controversy? I think a good bet is always figure there's dissension in a church, so kind of a given.
What was your most memorable interview as a journalist and your most memorable obituary, and why?
What was the second part?
Obituary. Most memorable obituary, and why?
Oh, that's a great question. You know, I really did like the everyday stories. That is not to say it wasn't a privilege to get to know Billy Graham a little bit. I think Grant Wacker, who's a wonderful Duke Divinity professor, wrote 2 books on Billy Graham, and he had his assistant call up everything I ever wrote about Billy Graham, and it was something like 500,000 words. That was a pleasure. I'll remember the time, if you could get past the handlers, Billy was a very accessible person. And one time of many, Ruth was in the hospital, and this was back in the age of answering machines, and we came home, and we hit the button for the message, and it was Billy leaving a message about Ruth. And my kids were probably 10 or 12, so Dad was a big guy in the house at that time with a message from Billy Graham. What we remember is he spoke so long and lovingly that the machine ran out on him. So I have a picture at my house. Remember back in the 90s when Mother Teresa opened a missions of charity here, so I got to interview her, and I have a picture somewhere on one of the walls at my house. They let me meet her at the private airport the next day, and she gave me miracle beads. But what I remember about that picture is that was like that, because she was like 2 feet tall. So going to lunch with Tammy in Palm Springs, and then leaving the bill with me was memorable. There are a lot of them. I've been to Germany. I did a lot of writing about the Holocaust, and so all those reviews. It's interesting to sit with someone in before grief, during, or after, and trying to walk them through this journey. So I remember Sandra Eubanks at Myers Park United Methodist was kind of a church leader, sang in the choir. She had a long, difficult journey with cancer, and when it ended, we could have written this obituary 2 years before, but we were writing after the fact. I sat with her 4 or 5 adult children and their spouses in the living room talking about the obituary, and they were a very opinionated family. And the kids in front of me, no, Mom wouldn't want that in the obit. Yes, we need to put that in the obituary. And I was sitting there, and they weren't fighting, but they were kind of, figuring out the obituary in a lively way. And I remember thinking to myself, a little bit of a calling is, I feel like God put me in this right place because this is where I need to be. This is where I feel comfortable helping them navigate the journey. Did another one with a retired lawyer on Carmel Road who was, they call them of counsel, is when they push you out the door. And he had retired, very prominent lawyer, and his life was built around his work. And he couldn't stand it. And one Friday night before a dinner party, he walked into the bedroom and killed himself with a gun. And his wife was in the kitchen. And they called me, and we sat around the dining room table. And I remember negotiating with the family about what to say about the cause of death. And so we ended up trying to make it a teachable moment as, if you have issues, talk to someone. I remember those kinds of moments.
Any other questions?
I don't have a question. I spoke with Ken a little earlier. We have a neighbor Jane and I are friends with. His name is David Perlman, and he wrote for The Observer.
What's his name?
David Perlman.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah, of course,
Perlman.
yeah.
Anyway, and he wrote for The Observer for a long time. And the only reason I'm bringing this up, I was curious if you ever had this experience. David wrote stories, obviously, so he would come, and a lot of y'all who know me, I'm a talker. And so I've known David since college years, from way back, but at any rate, I'm telling him this story, and he looks at me and he goes, "Get to the point." So I'm wondering, have you ever had it where you go, okay, I've had enough, get to the point?
Get to the point.
You're a storyteller.
You do have to have patience. You have to have an eagerness to want to be curious about people, to hear their story. Whether it's the waitress at the restaurant and my wife's pulling me away, or someone you're writing their loved one's obit, or this person has a bad diagnosis and you're talking to them. You have to have an eagerness to hear their story. You have to have a gift or a skill for navigating that conversation to where it needs to go. You have to, as the person's talking, you have to keep in mind what the main theme is. It's a gift or a curse, one or the other. But it's always a gift for me. But it's always fascinating to me that, 600 words in an hour and a half interview, I've got the essence of your life. And again, I don't know if that's, God is in the simple things, or when you strip away all the routines and the minutia of life, life is really about a few certain things: love, a legacy, where you found your meaning, a funny story that brings you to brings your essence to life. I think about that all the time. Someone said the other day, I forget where I was, they said it takes thousands of words to sum a person up. It takes more to sum up Leon Levine's life than someone else because it was such a rich, detailed life, but not really. You can sum them all up in 600 words. I say 600 because any more than that, I tell people, save your money for your kids, don't give it to the newspaper chain. So I tell people that all the time.
I think you have amazing memory. When you talk to people while you're waiting in line, you get the story. But do you also take notes and take record when you interview? And what do you do with them afterwards?
No, I almost never tape. That's a little bit old school. That's worrying about the tape working. That's wanting to avoid the tiresome part of back and forth back. So I take notes, keep it in my head. I've done tape recordings time and again, but it's not, I want to look people in the eye. I don't want to worry about the technology. I mean, when the times that I have done it, I can't wait to get back to the office and get the tape transcribed into a Word file, for fear that that didn't work. I think most reporters still rely on notes. The reporters that are left, there aren't many reporters.
A comment about decision making and God. Does God ever change? Well, if we're made in the image of God, I don't know anybody that tries to make a bad decision, ever. Every decision we try to make the best one ever. Sometimes with later information, we find out maybe it wasn't. Things change. So we have to give ourselves the grace to accept the ones that were maybe not right. Maybe the small town in Texas didn't fit. But we're also changing, always. Flexibility is the big name of the word that counts. But decision making, I don't know of anybody that tries to make a bad decision.
I mean, that's beautifully said. I think it speaks to the complexity and the mystery of what a calling is, and how and when you hear God's call in your life, when you hear that tap on the shoulder or a whisper. And yes, people change, circumstances change. If I try to get it into newspapers now, I'd be a nut. Back in the 70s, that's all there was. So things change, and that's why I think it's all, a mere mortal like myself can do is try to encourage you all to think about this and the role that God plays, not just in the world, but in your life. And I think about this all the time. I did a story once on a kid from Great Falls, South Carolina, that was elementary school, that was beaten badly in school and was at the pediatric unit at Atrium. And I remember his parents sitting in the room, and they say, we're in a no-lose situation. If he lives, we have him. If he dies, he's with Jesus. Is that what I believe? Not really. But my job was to try to portray what these parents believed. But I hear, that kind of thing. You can apply the complexity of God's call and God's hand on our lives 1,000 ways. And, that's a beautiful point, and all we can do is think hard about it and figure out what it means in our own personal lives.
We always learn from whatever decision we make. Even if we think it wasn't the right one, we still can learn a lot from it. And that way we don't make the same mistake again.
And a lot of the world and a lot of our journeys and a lot of decisions we make are not all black and white. And so I've tried, when I was in Shelby, I had a bad job. It wasn't the right job. I only stayed about 20 months. But in addition to barbecue, I made my two best friends of my life, two men who are my age, and we've walked. One of them's dealing with mental illness. One of them's dealing with a wife with really bad dementia. And so I don't think about the bad newspaper. I think about my two best friends. Honestly, when I was at Myers Park United Methodist Church, there were parts of it I liked more than others. Now that I'm out 5 years, I think about the friendships I made, laity. I think about the stories I got to tell. And so it's not, all these decisions aren't all black and white. And I suspect my friend who moved to Texas will say the same thing.
So is there ever a story that you regretted writing? A story that you look back now and is like, I wish I had not maybe written that.
Oh, that's a great question. I was a columnist in Rock Hill for a while, and I remember writing a column. I don't even remember the subject, but we had a really tough editor at the time. And I remember the next day coming in, and I remember getting an email from him, said, "You can do better." So I wish I hadn't written that one. Yeah, I think the ones like that were I regret are the ones that would somehow demean the people that would go see a Leroy Jenkins or believed in a Jim Bakker. I once wrote a really snarky column about Jamie Bakker, who wrote a book about being their son. And he was signing copies of Park Road Books, and Tammy was there. I wrote a really snarky, cynical column. And Tammy, man, she just laid into me. And I read that column, and, as I watched Eyes of Tammy Faye, I tried to be respectful. And so any time that I wasn't, those are the ones that I regret. And also, a lot of what I wrote was done on the fly. You're done, man, you got an hour.
I want to ask one other question. When I hear you say you've made such great friends in these other places, how much of this was in your head and how much of it was in your heart?
As far as?
Well, when you make your decisions, because I know a lot of that, sometimes I think it's from what speaks from your heart can make a lot of decisions as well.
A lot of it was from the foolishness of youth. Yeah, the foolishness of youth. Making a lifetime decision in 5 minutes or even less of forethought. And I'll be the first to admit that, a lot of these, thank God or someone, that I made the right decisions. So, yeah, a lot of them, you can get a theologian to come back and talk about prayer and how you pray about decisions. What does that look like? I prayed in my own way, probably. So a combination of head and heart. For me, I think more heart, probably. More instinct, more gut, more guess. If I'd moved to Gastonia, what would have happened if I hadn't begun dating a woman who moved to Charlotte? What if she had moved to Fairbanks, Alaska? And when I talk to people with obituaries, I see that a lot. That one moment in life they went this way instead of this way. They're all spiritual. I think you got it. Oh, is this better? Okay.
One more question. You had one?
I want to know if you have already written your obituary.
Oh, I got it. You're the third person to ask me that this week. I have not. It's in my head. But as the other person who asked me said, well, up in here is no good. No, I have not. And I wrote a column not long ago about turning 70. I don't know if anybody read it. It was in The Observer. I'll close reading that. I did write my mother's, and she had cancer and was on her deathbed, and so I wrote hers. We had time to do it, and if you were my mom, see what you have answered. I said, Mom, I've written this. Do you want to read it? Well, who would have wanted to read it? Read their own obituary written by a kid? Who would not have? The rest of you know, it's hard to put yourself in that position. Mom said no, and there may have been a word with the word H before the no. No part of it. I'm not sure what that was. I'm still trying to think of what that was. So I turned 70 not long ago, and I wrote a column, and this is how I ended it. Love, loss, blessings, sorrow, gratitude, fear. They are all rolled into 70 years. It's like I'm on a train bound for the future. I try to enjoy the ride, to savor every memory, every emotion, every stop I've passed along life's way. But it's hard. I wonder what that new pain might be. People ask me if we've put our names on the waiting list at Sharon Towers. I scan the obituary for peers I know. The train is speeding down the track. Yes, time flies, and there's no stopping now. At 70, I wonder where the journey ends. At peace, I hope. Thank you for your, yeah. There you go.
And it speaks to all of us.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. You all are a very great audience. I love doing this. Love having conversations and hearing people's questions. A little intimidated when I saw Will Willimon on the same agenda. He's got more degrees than I do, but hopefully we've talked about some universal things. So thank you very much.
I think we've died.
Try this one.
That brings us full circle to what the summer series has all been about, and that's what is asking yourself the question, what is God calling you to do? And we appreciate you, Ken. Thank you very much for coming. And next week in our series, Amy Jill Levine will be with us. We'll be back in the Youth Ministry Center, and she'll be with us on Zoom. So, and we'll also be Zooming our presentation as well. So we hope to see you then. Thank you all for coming. Have a great day.